Welcome to another episode of SummitCast. Today we're going to talk about what is Marxism doing today and why we should be worried about it. Welcome to another episode of SummitCast. We have Ed back with us again to talk about Marxism, and today we're going to pick up where we left off last time. And that is, what is Marxism doing today, how it's evolved since the early days, and we're going to talk about what that means for us. So Ed, tell us about how Marxism has evolved since what it was originally.
Okay, so we can talk in terms of the original or classical theory of Marxism, which predicted that the societies that were the first capitalist industrial societies, UK, Western Europe, North America, would be the first ones that would go socialist, because that fitted with Marx's idea of how society developed and changed over time, which he thought was a scientific theory. But of course that didn't happen. Russia was at that time in 1917, at the time of the Communist Revolution, still pretty feudal. It was based on the sort of, if you like, the formal power and hierarchical structure stretching down from the Tsar and the aristocracy, the landed aristocracy. But that had a communist revolution, but none of the communist revolutions in the Western societies, or the attempts at them, got anywhere near becoming a revolution. So thinkers like Georg Lukács, and in particular Antonio Gramsci, were very concerned about answering that question. Why wasn't the West going socialist as Marx said they should? In fact, said that they should first. So Antonio Gramsci, a prominent figure in the Italian Socialist Party, very prominent Marxist intellectual, is a journalist by trade. He is thrown into prison in 1926 by Benito Mussolini, and the intention is to basically shut him up. The quote from the judge, I think it was something along the lines, "We need to stop this mind from working for the next 20 years. He was seen to be that prolific and also dangerous in his thinking. But they didn't shut him up, because what he did was he wrote his essays and his thoughts and his ideas down on kind of scraps of paper. They were managed to get them out of the jail. They were put together into a collection, into a book, organized into a book, which was published ultimately in 1950, I think, or early 1950s. And but then it wasn't actually translated into English until the 1970s. Gramsci himself died, I think, in 1936. I think it was 1937 actually that Gramsci died. So he never got to really see any of his influence. But fundamentally, what he's trying to do is he's trying to answer that question that I talked about earlier. And so what Gramsci said as an explanation is, he said that Western societies weren't going to go Marxist just from you going out into the street and trying to sort of take on the capitalist state and sort of smash the ruling class. He said the reason for that is because you're not really understanding the way the ruling class work. And he came up with an idea which he called hegemony, or cultural hegemony. Hegemony meaning dominance. So what he's basically saying is that, as well as being the controlling the economy, the means of production, the ruling class also control the culture. They control the values, they control the belief systems, all of this influences the institutions, and all of that is a kind of glue that cements their power in place and keeps the subjugated classes, the proletariat, the working classes, keeps them, not only keeps them down, but also convinces them to go along with this society as it is. So there's two things going on in the capitalist society. One is in the Western modern capitalist society. One is coercion and the power of the state, which is kind of kept in the background a bit. They don't kind of forcefully come out with this coercion all the time, unlike, say, Tsarist Russia, which is a bit more obvious. What they really do is they control things through the culture and through the value system, and this cultural dominance, which makes the people, makes them basically go along with it, consent to their own oppression because they believe it all. So what he said was that if you try to have what he called a war of maneuver, he talked a lot in very military kind of metaphors. If you have a war of maneuver, you try and smash the state, you're going to lose. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to weaken, dissolve, progressively collapse the existing culture of the ruling class and put in place a new revolutionary cultural hegemony, which would basically convince the people, or certainly convince the workers and the peasants and the subjugated classes, convince them to see the truth of the whole situation and the truth of their oppression, and it would be an alternate cultural hegemony, an alternate cultural dominance, and it would be put them in a position whereby they had such a dominance over minds, over ideas, over institutions, over values, those kinds of things, that the final stage, the second stage of the Marxist revolution, which would happen in two stages, one would be this cultural destruction and then rebuilding of the revolutionary new culture. And the second would be, once that had taken place, the state and the ruling class would basically be kind of under siege, really, weakened, under siege, and it would be much easier just to kind of kick in the door and walk in and take power, or just go through the last stage of the revolution. So he pointed to certain things that that embodied, that maintained, and that transmitted the values, beliefs, and this cultural hegemony of the ruling class. So the family was one, for sure. This is where we learn our socialization and what's right and what's wrong, and how to deal with others, respect others, and the ideas that we're the cultural ideas that we're part of. Another is education, where these kinds of things are transmitted. Law is another one. Media is another one. So in effect, what he said really was, you need to get into, you need to infiltrate, subvert, and undermine those institutions, especially education. Certainly the family, certainly all the others, but especially education. You need to collapse the existing culture and traditions and beliefs and mores and values, and you need to supplant it with a revolutionary working class culture. Later thinkers would say, well, what is that revolutionary culture? Well, it'll be things like what ultimately became things like critical race theory. That things like in the educational world, things like queer studies, intersectionality, feminism, race studies, gender studies, all these kinds of things. This was deemed to be the new culture of the new revolutionary culture of the working class. Though even things like youth cults based around music, so punks, I don't know, Rastafarians, anything that was just kind of a little bit subversive, anti-authority, that was kind of a kick in the teeth for the existing culture, was to be promoted and was to be championed. And this was to be done through education, through family, through all these other things. So as time goes on, you get the development of these ideas, and you get the ideas of Gramsci being picked up, certainly in the 70s in the West, in Western universities and academia. And you get the expansion and the development of his kinds of ideas. So as we move from, if you think about the 1970s, 1980s, the political battleground is really all about it's a lot to do with economy and about the economy. And you've got situations, for example, in the UK, where you've got the old style traditional labour movement, which comes into conflict in the 1980s with Margaret Thatcher's government a number of times, but famously with the 1984-85 miners' strike. And the Thatcher government wins comprehensively. It's you know, by the late 1980s, the old style classical Marxist, classical class struggle labour movement is nowhere, really. But as that's going on, you've got people who've taken Gramsci's ideas, people like, I can't remember his first name, it's Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, who've then taken that and they've then adapted those ideas, and they've moved the battle on away from the economy into the area of the culture. So you start to see things like parties of the left, like the British Labour Party, decides it's going to junk the idea of the command economy. It's going to accept the free market now. It's going to, you know, going to get rid of all that old stuff. But what it is doing is it's very much taking on board, you know, the stuff around you know, critical race theory and different you know, minority groups who now they're now the oppressed ones. They're the victim class, and you know, it's sort of white, middle class, typically male, straight, you know, and anything basically that's a kind of conservative value or a purveyor of a conservative value is now the oppressor. So you can see what's happening is that you're starting to see Gramsci's template is being enacted in the latter part of the 20th century, and certainly by our time, we're seeing exactly what Gramsci wanted. He would be delighted if he was alive today to see what's going on. He believed that once this alternate cultural hegemony was fully in place, the remaining remnants of the ruling class would be in effect under kind of a kind of siege, and you only had to then go to the next stage, which would be the final political revolution. So, you know, terms like identity politics, identifying, you know, racial groups, racial minorities, gay people, women as the designated oppressor classes, this kind of thing comes out of the thinking that was inspired by Gramsci, certainly through the 1970s. It's also present in the other members of the Frankfurt School that I mentioned earlier, a group of Marxist intellectuals who develop things like critical theory. So their idea is that you're going to deconstruct and just criticize into the ground every aspect of Western society, civilization, values, structures, institutions, mores, all these kinds of things. They transplant a number of their members to the United States in the 1930s, and they start becoming prominent in academia. One of their leading lights was Herbert Marcuse, who went to Columbia University initially, because a lot of these guys, they were Marxist intellectuals and they were also Jewish. That's not a good thing to be in the 1930s in Germany, either of those things. So he takes up professorships at a number of universities, ending up at San Diego University. And Marcuse, his contribution is things like, he identifies that the people that are going to take over from the working class as the revolutionary class will be Black people, gay people, women, and later there's the addition of the environment as well. The environment is being oppressed by the capitalist bourgeois class. And we start to see something of that, it seems to me, in modern environmentalism. You know, it's a vehicle for the destruction of capitalism and the free market. That's what environmentalism really is. It's not
what it's become now. Yeah,
it's what it's become.
Yeah.
Not to say that there aren't, you know, ecological and environmental problems, but it's really becoming a vehicle for that. So these two strands of tradition, if you like, the thinking of Gramsci that gets picked up in the 1970s in the West, and the members of the Frankfurt School who add in things like the ideas around logic. So they distort logic. So an idea was logical if it supported their thinking, and if it didn't support their thinking, then it was illogical. If it supports the left, it's logical. So that's the new definition of logic. Okay, things like the use of sex and sexuality as a revolutionary force. So Herbert Marcuse writes Eros and Civilization, and he's basically saying that to engage in every and any sort of kink, perversion, whatever you want to do, just go and do it, because this is a revolutionary act that is helping to collapse the existing set of mores, and that will help to collapse the existing society. A lot of the feminists of the 1960s and 70s pick up on this thread as well, that if they can sort of subvert gender and gender roles, if they can change all of that, if they can sort of kind of collapse the family as another front in the whole thing, that this will ultimately bring about the future Marxist socialist state. And in our time, we have come to call that something slightly different. If you collect up all of the ideas around critical race theory, around gender theory, queer theory, every other kind of theory, or critical this, critical that, collected together, that we would just call that's what woke politics is, and that's where it comes from. Woke essentially means that you've been basically indoctrinated through the education system, which is now being captured really almost fully by people with that kind of thinking, that you've been indoctrinated by those people into that mindset and into those ideas. And the real purpose of it isn't to have a nice utopian, nicer society, or just kind of be nice to people, or sort of a nice little moral system. What I call the grand strategy of the left is, its purpose is to dissolve and collapse the existing institutions, the existing values, the existing culture, existing ways of doing things, even the existing thought. Debates about whether 2 + 2 does actually equal 5 instead of 4, stuff like that, to collapse all of that. And then you can step in with that final stage of the solution, which is, okay, now we capture the state itself and the levers of power. So Gramsciism really looks like a description of our times. And I submit that is what it is, really.
Mm-hmm. To what extent was it centrally planned, or was the strategy conscious on the part of people?
Well, certainly some people were very much buying into that and knew fully what it was about. Some of the early feminist thinkers around about 1970, thereabouts. I haven't got the quote for anybody, but basically acknowledging, and I believe it was the book The Female Eunuch by Germaine Greer. I stand to be corrected if that's not true, but my understanding is that it was the introduction to that book, which effectively said, look, the point of all this really is Marxist revolution. That's what we're really about. So let's get on with it, I think was her phrase. The redefining of education, which took a sort of strange route, because Gramsci's work was first translated into, or earlier it was translated into Portuguese, and it was picked up by a Brazilian intellectual, Paulo Freire, I think his name is, I might get that wrong, who wrote a book that basically redefined education. The whole purpose of education in Brazil was to be, either education was about cementing in place the values of the ruling class, or it was about sort of radical critical theory that would allow poorer, downtrodden people to develop their class consciousness and their revolutionary new culture, which would ultimately collapse the existing system. And he was very successful in that. In the 1960s, I think it was, in Brazil. And that idea has crept into Western education as well. I was a teacher myself. I went through teacher training. That was the whole idea. That was the whole idea. You know,
you spoke about socialism was the goal of education.
Well, the Marxist socialist end state really was what it was all leading up to, fundamentally. And the idea was that you taught kids the basic tenets of the theory. So, you know, certainly when I did my teacher training, we had I was struggling to think. I'm supposed to be an English teacher here. I don't really know anything about English teaching, but other people would come into the seminar. Other student teachers would come into the seminar and say, "Yeah, well, I'm teaching my year 9 kids, which was like 8th grade. Teaching my year 9 kids. I'm doing gender issues with them." What it really meant was that I'm teaching them feminism, radical feminism. You know, men the evil oppressor class, women the innocent victim class, and you know, this sort of subverting of the roles and the relationship between men and women, which has only ever been based on a sort of cynical power relationship with men exploiting women. That was the sort of idea of it, and that was the early 90s. So God knows what's happening now. Well, I think I know what's happening now, but
it's got the agenda's really made a lot of progress in that since the 90s.
Well, you've got, I mean, certainly in American universities and a little bit later on British universities, but Western universities generally, is where it seems to spread out from. So the point at which it seems to enter these nations, and you've got, you know, one generation of lecturers and professors who teach the next generation, and they become the next professors, but they're also going to become the people who go out into the white collar professional jobs, into things like the industries that have a lot to do with influencing other people. So they go into education, they go into law, they go into the HR departments, they go into the media, they go into, you know, fortunately for these sort of the neo-Marxists, as I call them, they go into those kinds of industries, and they are then replicating and multiplying generation by generation these kinds of ideas. So
yeah, if you're running a newspaper, you know, you want to hire a journalist, they've gone through a journalism school and they've been indoctrinated into these concepts. So that's what they're going to be writing. It's
in things like it's things like in the vocational schools as well. So like the journalism school, you know, things like law, you know, it's certainly made its appearance in the criminal justice system. I say to people, look, I've worked in 5 different public sector organizations in my working life, and they are all affected by this, including the armed forces, where I was there for 10 years. And they basically, just to give an example, cemented the power and the position of these kinds of ideas by linking it to senior officers' promotion. So if you didn't go with what we would call woke ideas, they would usually put it under a different name. But if you didn't go along with those kinds of ideas, then you weren't going to get promoted, and you knew that. So, and you didn't just have to give some sort of passive consent to it. Originally, it was passive consent. You had to just agree with their thinking. I did the 5-day UK Armed Forces Equality and Diversity course back in 2006. That was the thing. You know, you didn't just anymore consent to it or just let it go by. You had to actively show that you'd done something to further equality and diversity further, you know, which has as its basis the sort of things like your critical race theory and your gender theory and your feminism, all these kinds of things. So
But
even in the armed forces.
Earlier, you were telling me about the thing you had to do with you had to go and actively find instances of racism. You had a quota, and
yeah.
Want to tell that story?
So I was the it was actually called, it was a quality and diversity advisor for the Air Force base that I was stationed at the time. And I was part of a squadron, which was a training squadron. We trained aircraft technicians. We had about 60 or so instructors, some in uniform, some are civilians. And every couple of months, I think it was, we had to make a sort of like a return on a form, so like a declaration really of what equality and diversity issues we had discovered within our squadron in the last 2 months. And month after month, squadrons were just sending these things back going, no, blank, I haven't seen anything. I haven't had any incidents. No, nothing yet. No. And this went on for some while, you know, this was well over a year, went on for. Then one day we were all called into the guy who was kind of like the head of HR, really. He was officer commanding the personnel management squadron, head of HR, who said, look, the base has kind of got into trouble with the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the government commission that oversees all this stuff and these policies and all the rest of it. And they don't believe that we haven't had any incidents. And they think, you know, basically they've come back to us and said that you're obviously either lying or you're not trying hard enough. You haven't found enough incidents of racism, sexism, all this sort of stuff. So we were then instructed by the effective head of HR to go back into our squadrons and to go and eavesdrop on people's conversations. We were to go into sort of coffee, coffee rooms and staff, the staff rooms, these kinds of things, just hang around in places and eavesdrop and listen into people's conversations. And if somebody told, let's say, a mother-in-law joke or something like that, or anything really, we were to take them aside, basically tell them off, and then record that as an incident. So we now had an incident. So we had to basically spy on our colleagues. This is common in workplaces now.
You had to find incidents of racism where there really wasn't, and that kind of thing.
You just had to go away and find something. Sorry, but we hadn't seen any evidence. Well, you're not trying hard enough, or you're lying. So you go back out there and you find something. So, empirical evidence isn't good enough for them. Is one thing. You must be racist. Well, for one thing, you're the armed forces, and that's a sort of right-wing thing. So come on, you must be bad in all these ways. Even if it's unconscious, it's unconscious bias, all this kind of stuff. And the other real problem with it, everybody's, whose job is it to ensure that we have equality and diversity and have all this kind of, no incidents of racism and everyone's speaking correctly and thinking the right thoughts, not expressing an opinion that is, dangerous. Well, apparently it's everybody's business, actually. It's mainly the equality and diversity provider, but it's everybody's business. So everybody now has to check everybody else. Everybody has to listen in and eavesdrop on everybody else and then snitch on them. If they say something wrong, they think something wrong, they inadvertently come out with something, they tell a joke, something like that.
This is kind of like the secret police in the Soviet Union, is what it's sounding like. Everyone's informing on everybody, and you may not get sent to a gulag in Siberia, but you don't get promoted. You might lose your job, or
Absolutely. You're gonna, if you are found to be doing that, then, as somebody said to me in a work capacity, your card will be marked, and they will find a way of punishing you. So look out. Ultimately you can lose your job. There was a guy, it was a couple of years ago in the UK, who worked for a supermarket, And he was something like a meter and greeter type person in the supermarket. And one day he put a comedy sketch by a Scottish comedian, Billy Connolly, onto his Facebook page, and he just shared it on Facebook. And Billy Connolly was kind of having a bit of a dig at religion, all religions really, just having a little skit on stage. And he got fired from his job because he posted that on Facebook. You know, this is scary stuff, you know, and people know this. People know that they are, you know, that they could really be in trouble. You know, they've got the power of taking away your means of subsistence over you. So, you know, so where do you go with that?
Really breaking down the relationships between people, isn't it? You know, you can't talk to someone honestly heart to heart because you're afraid you'll get reported. So
yeah,
it just breaks down all the bonds in society between people.
Well, absolutely. And when you look at places like the Soviet Union, if you look at places like communist China and the Eastern European communist states, one of the things was that you know, people were rewarded for turning in their neighbor or even their family member. Children would be applauded and be rewarded for informing about their parents. Yeah, you know, my dad said this the other day at the dinner table, and the parents, you know, that was serious trouble. You know, you might disappear, you might be taken away in the middle of the night, you might be, you know, or you might, you know, just be demoted at work, or something else happens to you, you lose your apartment, that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
So this equality and diversity kind of legislation and bureaucracy it's a way of effectively centralizing control in the state and you know, disempowering individuals and making them less free and more controlled.
I think it has a couple of ideas underpinning it, but it certainly has the basic neo-Marxist narrative that there are certain oppressor classes or oppressor groups in a kind of cynical power relationship and attempting to exploit certain victim groups, and that's it. That's all there is. That the whole thing is built around that. So that's underpinning it. But on the surface, it kind of looks plausible. It looks good. Hey, you know, let's everybody be equal. Let's everybody be nice to people. Let's not be nasty to anybody who's of a different race or sexuality like that. Oh, well, that looks good, you know. Mm-hmm. So there is, I think, there's equality as moral principle, which makes it appealing. But then coming on the heels of that is something that's actually a quite different idea, which is this a victim oppressor narrative and things like unconscious bias. You know, so you didn't think you were a racist, but apparently you are. You know, you just didn't know it. And you got to have that trained out of you as well.
Yeah, and if you deny you're racist, that's just evidence of how deep the racism is.
that just shows that that you're really kind of, you know, they need to work even harder on you because you can't admit that you're racist. So one of the criticisms, one of the critiques of that idea of Marxism generally, and we can apply it to the neo-Marxist or woke theories as well, is the idea of what's called falsificationism. So I'm not sure when he was writing, it was sort of mid-20th century, a philosopher called Karl Popper came up with the idea of, he was looking at what was a scientific idea and what was not a scientific idea. And this kind of goes back to the question you were saying about, was Marxism, was it really scientific or not, and so on. And also explains something about the pull of Marxist thinking and neo-Marxist and woke thinking. And that's this. He kind of says, the problem with it is really this. If you, well, if I'll tell it through a little anecdote. Many years ago, I was at a party and was having a conversation with a guy who was a Marxist, as a guy I knew at the time. And he was talking about politics. I said, but hey, you know what? Because this is in the 1980s. I said, most working class people, majority of working class people were voting for Margaret Thatcher. They were voting conservative. Most were going to, and his answer was, yes, but that's only because they've been duped by bourgeois ideology, you see. That's what it is. So the thing is, if you take that idea, if your objection to the thing is actually just a sign that you have been fully duped, fully kind of indoctrinated with the prevailing hegemonic culture and belief system, then the problem with that is that no amount of empirical evidence and no amount of experience of your own eyes, no amount of this really doesn't work. Look at the horrendous mess of the thing. None of that is going to change your mind, because all of that is just, well, that's just bourgeois propaganda. That's what the ruling class want you to think. 100 million deaths under Marxist-Leninist governments, which is about the figure which some French historians calculated. No, that's just that's just bourgeois propaganda. That you don't believe that. So once you're inside this little intellectual hall of mirrors, you can't get out, or it's very difficult to get out, because everywhere you turn, well, that's what they want you to think. Yeah, but you see, you need to be clever. You see, you're not going to.
Yeah, because there are no objective facts. So there's only information or ideas that will advance the revolution or advance what you want.
Wokeness, neo-Marxism, classical Marxism all have to get rid of objective facts, which is why you have things like conversations and social media about, or websites about, well, in certain circumstances 2 + 2 does actually equal 5. There is no enduring. Everything is contextual, everything is situational, and you're within the little cultural hegemonic sort of power play and scheme of the ruling classes. So you're not really able to think for yourself anyway. It's a tremendously convenient and a brilliant sort of way of just kind of, I suppose, getting people to ignore the evidence of their own eyes.
Yeah.
So you can get a society where people are dying, and yet people are still supporting the Communist Party. Because you can't get out of this thing. Once you're in it, you're sort of trapped in it.
That's my wife calls it Soviet consciousness. So she'll say, the younger generations of Russians have more kind of free market economics and these liberties and all these philosophies, but sometimes she'll meet an older person who's Russian, and just say, the person has Soviet consciousness, because they they're so indoctrinated into those older Soviet philosophies that they still live in that world of having this oppressive government control of everything, and they don't have the ability to move beyond that anymore, even though the world has changed.
Yeah, well, it was that phenomenon was critiqued by Karl Popper, and he said a genuinely scientific idea is a falsifiable idea. In other words, it's open to being modified by empirical evidence, the evidence of what you see and experience. Marxism is one of a range of unfalsifiable ideas. It can never be modified, no matter how much experience or evidence that you see, that you have, or any kind of argument. So people who are fully within that consciousness, which I suggest it's a pseudo consciousness, and it's a pseudo reality. You think of your leading light politicians these days, they're not going to just go, well, do you know what, I've changed my mind. I come to think of it, maybe I was wrong. Yeah. Your Bernie Sanderses and your AOCs and your people in Britain, Jeremy Corbyn, just spend their lives in that consciousness, because, like I say, it's kind of a hall of mirrors. They can't get out. So
Well, and it's kind of been when you talk about this war, the Cultural Revolution and the war on culture, it seems like it's replacing the values of God, and through that the value of personal responsibility. That, you know, in our beliefs, we believe in this personal responsibility for our ascension, for our growing spiritually and reuniting with God. And so in culture, in economics, you have this idea that you are personally responsible for your outcome, and there is no oppressor, there is no oppressed. It's only you at the end of the day. And that seems like that socialism is the enemy of that philosophy of transcending yourself, of becoming something better.
Yeah, because whatever situation or state that you're in, it was always someone else's fault. And you've now got a green light and all of the tools you need and all of the permissions you need to take it out on that group of people, you know, whoever they were. And there's a lot of similarities really in all of these ideologies and all forms of fanaticism and these kinds of things. One is that they always find a scapegoat. They're great at tapping into people's dissatisfaction with their situation, with life. They're always unfalsifiable ideas. They're always kind of circular. They're always this hall of mirrors that you can't get out of. And they've basically trapped their kind of adherents into this pseudo consciousness, this pseudo reality, and which they can't get out. But it's kind of emotionally satisfying for them. I think that's one of my other explanations as to why it holds this attraction. There's a certain, in the activists themselves, there's a certain emotional satisfaction, and it does, in a way, it provides this kind of grand explanation for all things in a similar way that religion does. In fact, there's this wasn't lost on Antonio Gramsci himself, or some of the other leading lights in this area. In fact, one of the quotes of Gramsci is, he says that socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. And I'm quoting from some work by James Lindsay, the academic. It says, this is the character upon which so much, Gramsci is the character upon which so much of the left's world has turned. He's the one who, in some sense, after the revolutions, the attempted revolutions, except the Russian one, had failed. This is the man who reinvigorated that socialist religion, who brought it back from the edge of death, understanding and creating cultural Marxism, and using cultural Marxism to lay the groundwork that allowed for the success, as I've called it, Leninism 3.0, which was executed by Mao Zedong in China, and Leninism 4.0, which is being foisted upon the rest of the world, especially the West, right now under the brand name of woke. So that's and I think if we put a link to James Lindsay's podcast in with the video, would be, I think people would find, if they want to go a little bit deeper, it's a little bit intellectual, a bit academic, but if they go a little bit deeper, they'll see a really excellent podcast, a really excellent explanation of Gramsci and his thinking right there.
Yeah, we can put a link in the description. It's interesting to me hearing talking about it in religious terms, because you know, as Noah was saying, the goal of life and spiritual evolution is return to God and become one with all life, in a sense, become one with all the saints in heaven and the body of God, and become one with that. And then, but it's something which happens at the end of spiritual evolution, at the end of one's, you know, lifetimes, you know, in the ascension. But then what, in one sense, what Marxism and this cultural Marxism is wanting to do is to produce that union where you give up your identity to become one of a group of people, one of a class of people, one of a collective of people, and it's the collective that's important rather than the individual. So it's kind of the surrender of that individuality down here, you know, in a kind of a nihilistic way, instead of in the return to God, where you become one with everything, but with all of your individuality enhanced in a sense.
Well, it's kind of it's a false path. It's a fake path to something that has a sort of passing resemblance in some ways. Has a kind of resemblance, a sort of facsimile of the genuine spiritual path. You are becoming one with something greater than yourself. Though in this case, it's the revolutionary movement and it's the socialist state. But that revolutionary movement and that socialist state doesn't recognize any individuality or indeed any worth of you, which is the complete opposite of the genuine spiritual path, where you find your true individuality by giving up the sort of the human identity, and you find that your true identity handed back to you in return. So it resembles in a way a spiritual path. It resembles a religious cult. I could call it a political cult, really, and it's being pumped into the minds of young people, entire generations of young people all across the Western world, if not the rest of the world, at our expense, by the way, as taxpayers. And it's really a kind of, I mean, now and again, I think I've said to other people, higher education is no longer really education. Really, it's an initiation into the cult of leftist intellectualism. That's really what it is, or what we would call wokeness. So, and I had that too, and I had to get rid of it.
Deprogram yourself from the cult.
I had to deprogram myself, So,
how did you do that?
With some difficulty, I have to tell you. I've been brought up to believe that I don't know, anything American was kind of the source of all evil, for one thing.
Yeah.
America equaled bad. Anything that was sort of vaguely, not party politically conservative, but any kind of traditional value or belief was sort of bad. That men were bad, and as I was bad. Girlfriends that I had when I was young, it's kind of end up sort of apologizing to them. Well, hey, why are you apologizing to me, Ed? Oh, well, this is okay. Yeah, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. Don't mind the fact that you kissed me, or you did this, or you did that.
As a representative of the patriarchy.
yeah, exactly that. And I do see that a lot of young men these days are crushed. They're really crushed by that idea. Anything that's even the slightest hint of masculinity is bad. It's toxic masculinity. It's really saying, there's something inherently wrong with you if you're male. You've kind of got a problem. You almost like it's not a problem that you just kind of like was a mistake. It's intrinsically part of you.
It's original sin, isn't it? It's like it's a religious doctrine.
Yeah. Yes. There's certainly been other commentators who talked about. I think it might have been. I don't think it was Dinesh D'Souza, but other commentators who talked about wokeness as being a religious cult, and it has original sin. You're a sinner. However, you can redeem yourself if only you will give assent to this whole idea and go through the kind of the admission that you're a bad person for all sorts of reasons, and you do the things that they want you to do, and that's the only way that you can be redeemed. It's the only way you can be redeemed. Don't think there's nothing else, no other way. Just do it through our church, quote unquote, and then you'll be okay. The sort of scarlet stain will be washed from your garments through that means.
So Ed, how did you deprogram yourself?
How did I deprogram myself? Well, what can I say really? I think there's probably a couple of things really. One was that going through the internal struggle myself, which was really hard. From the, in my 20s, I had really serious backlash from some people, family members, that kind of thing. What do you think you're doing? This is American, for God's sake. That's enough just on its own, just to condemn it. It was Christian as well. Oh my God. How could you possibly go with that? So I kind of had to go through a lot of those sort of internal struggles in my own mind, dealing with other people around me. And I just kind of, I guess I just kind of hung in there, really. Mm-hmm. There were times, and plenty of times, when I just thought, should I just kind of like, because everyone else seems to be going in this direction. Should I just go with the flow, go with the world, what the world thinks. And that was one thing. So I suppose it was hanging in there. It was being exposed to other ideas. It was being exposed, not just within the teachings, it was being exposed to other ideas sort of around and about, and kind of looking at things and thinking, wait, there's 100 million people dead from Marxism in the 20th century, and no one's talking about this. We talk about the Holocaust, and we should, but no one mentions what the Soviets and the Chinese and the Eastern Europeans did. That was one thing. And the other thing I think was just experience of life. It was just going along and realizing once you paid taxes, you had to hold down your job and your house and you had kids. And the realization going along that was sort of, this idea is a pile of nonsense. This stuff is nonsense, and just pulling away the layers of the thing and realizing that human beings are not like that. They're not the way that's described. There were some useful counter arguments. Karl Popper's idea of falsificationism is one, and just a lot of empirical evidence, really, and looking at some of these people,
facts. being willing to look at facts.
Being willing to look at facts, yeah, and Britain had a pretty hefty experiment with, I suppose you'd call it social democracy or something like that, in the late 60s and definitely in the 70s. And I lived through that, and it sucked. I remember being 7 or 8 years old, probably 7 years old, and there was another miners' strike in the early 70s, and the whole country went down onto a forced 3-day week of work. Everyone worked only 3 days a week, and all the electricity was cut off. And we sat there at home at the age of 7, trying to play board games in the evening because there was no television, by candlelight. So,
wow,
yeah, that kind of thing. The sort of and the violence of some of these people, as well. These people were pretty violent, and still are. Yeah.
So I get, hopefully people will see how bad does it have to get before people realize that this isn't working and this is not a good road to go down. And it's starting to get to that point now where I think more people are waking up to what the threat is and how bad it could be.
I think there is a lot of waking up, and there's a lot of quite big figures on media like YouTube and in other areas. There was a bit of an awakening of consciousness that wasn't there, say, a couple of years ago. And you're kind of sitting there thinking, am I the only one that thinks this? Am I the only one that sort of thinks that this is a problem? But now you're getting things like I know there was the sort of a kind of a sanction or a prohibition around critical race theory in US universities. UK has ended unconscious bias training. There was recently a report on race relations in the UK by a black academic, Dr. Tony Sewell, And its conclusion was basically Britain is not an institutionally racist country, which caused howls of outrage among the left. And this is a black guy, ethnic minority guy, and the team that he was with were predominantly ethnic minority people, saying, yeah, I don't think that's, there's still problems, but it's not an institutionally racist country. Well, how dare he say that? I can't remember some of the things, the abuse he got online, but told that he wasn't really black, for example. That kind of thing.
I've heard that with relation to American race relations with the slaves. And so you have people who are Nigerian or some form of immigrant to America, not through slavery, and they say, well, you can't have an opinion on the black issue because your great grandparents weren't slaves. And so it's like, where does it, they have to keep limiting further and further this who gets to be the party. It's
very characteristic of extreme ideologies. That's another thing that apart from all the other things are, unfalsifiable, not open to evidence, emotional rather than rational, is that they are very sort of splittist. In fact, that was when I first came to the States. I first came to the ranch in 1988. I was actually in the male washroom. I was discussing this subject with the American guy there, and he said, yeah, that's because that's the nature of darkness. It's not darkness is divisive and splits things down and kind of finds that this is an enemy and they're an enemy now, and we were okay with this people here, but now we're not okay with those people there. Whereas light is about unity and acceptance and and brotherhood and so on. So that made an impression on me. That was one thing that helped me to kind of like just move on a little bit.
As a long-term strategy, it seems that it's going to cut them off the knees if you're constantly trying to divide people further and further and further. The only common factor you have is America's evil, the West is evil, this religion is evil, or religion in general is evil. But when you don't have that uniting principle, I don't know. I feel like we have the winning strategy.
Yeah. One of the I'm going to say one of the phenomenon of revolutions is there's the person who last year or last month or last week was in, now all of a sudden they're not in, or all of a sudden that idea isn't the correct idea to have. And so you find that within revolutions, and it was particularly evident was certainly evident in the Soviet Union, where some of the people who were originally great sort of contributors to the revolution, what's his name? Kirov, I think it was, tremendously popular, tremendously capable individual in Stalin's regime. All of a sudden, he's assassinated, he's found dead. No one's quite sure, but it's almost certainly Stalin himself, because he's jealous of the guy's popularity or his power. Trotsky was the head of the Red Army. He won the Russian Civil War for them, but he gets edged out. And then there's Trotskyism. We don't believe in Trotskyism. We believe in Stalinism. And, Trotsky's a traitor. He ends up with an ice axe in the back of his head in 1940. So he's murdered as well. So it's kind of like...
And they keep taking people out of the photographs.
Retouching the photographs to remove Trotsky or put Stalin in or that kind of stuff. So retelling truth, and it's all satirized in George Orwell's novel 1984. One of the sayings is that revolutions always eat their own.
Yeah.
They have this very splittist, you've got to be ideologically very, very pure, very, very absolutely on message all the time, and if something was okay last week, it might not be okay this week. It's satirized in Monty Python and was it The Life of Brian? Are you the people's front of Judea? No, with the Judean people's front. That thing. So
the original is kind of Robespierre in the French Revolution. He was the most revolutionary, and then eventually they get rid of him because he's not revolutionary enough.
it was actually that was Monty Python and a bit of satire. But
yeah,
I was talking to a friend of mine back when I was in university, who was a convinced Marxist, and he was talking about the Communist Party, and he said, "No, that's not the British Communist Party. That's the Communist Party of Great Britain. There are actually two separate organizations, and they hate each other. They can't, each one is a splittist, the other one's a splittist. No, you're a splittist, you're a traitor to the cause. No, you're a traitor to the cause.
Well, and of course, the Soviets and the Chinese communists were no fan of each other, right?
It said that they almost came to blows, as in a full scale war, which could have gone nuclear. And I did read somewhere that it was Richard Nixon, I think. So we're talking early 1970s, who basically managed to kind of like dissuade them from fully coming to a full-on war between each other. I don't know what he said, but they kind of went to Nixon, I think, and sort of said, we're going to really have a go at the Chinese right now. What do you reckon? No, don't do that. It's not a good idea.
Probably Kissinger behind the scenes. He was a very, very smart guy.
Might have been Kissinger, actually. I might be wrong. It might have been Kissinger instead of Nixon. But.
Well, yeah. Well, maybe this is a good place to end. You got out, so there's hope for others that they can get out of this. I think you talked about people on YouTube and so on who are giving a counter narrative. One that comes to mind is Jordan Peterson, who is very eloquent, and so the left can't stand him because he. He's speaking about reality and personal responsibility and so on, and so there's signs of hope, and I think I don't know. I guess we just have to pray and do our bit to get the word out and talk to people when there's an opening.
Yeah.
Sure. So thank you very much for being on the show. I really appreciated hearing from you and hearing your perspective.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Noah. It's been a pleasure to come on the show.
So we'll see you next week on SummitCast.